We're seeing something that we haven't seen in all my years of covering politics. We're seeing yard signs for Secretary of State races.
Once obscure secretaries of state have been on the front lines of protecting the vote for 2 years.
They can't do mail-in vote. How are they going to do it if they don't have the money to do it?
The president is saying that he is trying to defund the United States Postal Service to prevent Americans from voting.
Video obtained by 12 News shows a group chanting outside of Secretary of State Katie Hobbs's home over the election results.
Look, Brad, I got to get 12,000 votes, and I have them times a lot, and therefore I won the state.
We have to stand by our numbers. We believe our numbers are right.
Unfortunately, MAGA extremists discovered how important secretaries of state are too. And this midterm, the same people who eroded trust in the United States electoral process are vying for these positions so they can run the next major election. Over the past 2 years, we've watched the US electoral system be attacked, discredited, and used as a scapegoat for violence. Fear around the voting process has only grown. Over 40% of US voters worry about intimidation at the polls. 67% fear violence will follow the election's results, and their fears aren't unfounded. In Arizona's Maricopa County, extremists armed and dressed in tactical gear camped out at ballot drop-off sites to intimidate voters until a federal judge issued a restraining order. A study done by the Brennan Center found that 1 in 6 election officials have received death threats or racist and gendered harassment because of their job. This has caused a shortage of election workers leading up to Election Day. And of course, we've seen what happens when the election results don't go the extremist way. In 2020, both Democratic and Republican secretaries of state across the country were central in the fight against Trump's election subversion. In the lead up to 2022, they've stood between these threats of violence and fair election outcomes. But what is a Secretary of State exactly? They are the chief clerk in 47 of the United States' 50 state governments. Generally, they're kind of paper pushers who manage a state's business registry, campaign finances, records, the state seal, and even oversee bingo.
The big thing and the thing that most people think about is overseeing elections.
That's Jena Griswold, Colorado's Secretary of State. She is one of the secretaries launched to the national stage in 2020. Secretary Griswold protects a model of what election systems could and should look like across the country.
Colorado is considered the nation's gold standard for election administration, both in terms of security and access. The pandemic was a really good example of why Colorado's election model is one of the strongest in the nation. Coloradans didn't have to imagine going into crowded voting centers in the middle of the pandemic pre-vaccine. They were able to vote from the comforts of their homes.
When COVID-19 upended our lives, anxiety grew over how the 2020 election was going to be pulled off safely. Support for mail-in voting surged, and ultimately half of US voters voted by mail in 2020. But Trump saw an opportunity to exploit an already vulnerable climate for political gain. He spun lies about mail-in voting's vulnerability to fraud and defunded an already struggling United States Postal Service.
Absentee is good. Mail-in universal is very, very bad.
Okay, first, let's clear up one thing. Absentee voting and mail-in voting are essentially the same thing. The biggest difference is that mail-in voting automatically mails ballots to registered voters, and absentee ballots need to be requested by voters. But mail-in voting states just so happen to have the highest voter participation in the country. And Trump knew that. So while the average citizen attempted to personally fund the USPS by buying stamps in bulk, Trump had a plan in motion to delegitimize the electoral process and its result before a single vote was cast. Prior to the pandemic, Colorado was one of 5 states that sent mail-in ballots to every registered voter. Secretary Griswold wasn't going to let her state's model election system be undermined by disinformation.
We set up statewide ballot tracking so Coloradans could see with their own eyes when their ballot was sent to when it was counted. We also assisted states across the nation in expanding access to mail balloting. Because we were able as a nation to expand access, the country had record turnout among both Democrat and Republican voters. And all the data shows that vote by mail doesn't help one party over the other, it just helps voters. It also increases security because our foreign adversaries can't hack a piece of paper, which is a paper ballot.
It's a fair point. But despite logic-based reasoning and countless studies, research, audits, more than 2/3 of Republicans still don't believe Joe Biden legitimately won the election. Even worse, of the 27 Republicans running for Secretary of State, their state's chief election officer, 21 have denied or feel doubts about the 2020 election. In May 2021, the America First Secretary of State coalition was launched to support election-denying alt-right candidates in contested 2020 battleground states. Their races are all very close. One of the founders is Jim Marchant, Nevada's Republican Secretary of State candidate.
So my opponent has some really unique and interesting views about the role of the Secretary of State's office.
This is Cisco Aguilar, the Democratic candidate for Nevada's Secretary of State.
He's not a serious leader, but his threats are extremely serious. He wants to take away early access to the polls, mail ballot voting, same-day voter registration, everything that we have achieved as a state to increase that voter access, he wants to eliminate.
In fact, Marchant and his coalition want to completely upend U.S. voting systems by jettisoning voting machines.
Some of you may have heard that I convinced a county here in Nevada to implement the new prototype for the election system that we're going to deploy all around the country with your help.
The test county that Marchant convinced is Nevada's rural, red Nye County. And this radical new election system, it's a hand count. Yes, they want all U.S. votes to be counted by hand. And don't worry, the process is even more convoluted, slow, and prone to both errors and fraud than you think. It requires a group of election workers, a person to read a ballot out loud, talliers, a verifier, and observers to go through every single vote together. Reports said that it took groups about 3 hours to count 50 ballots, and mismatched tallies led to recounts. The ACLU said election results and personal voter information were in danger of being leaked. Partisan influence was also a problem. A hand count volunteer openly carrying a firearm removed an ACLU observer from a tally room. The volunteer ended up being a GOP Central Committee vice chair for the county. Fortunately, Nevada Supreme Court ruled that the hand count is illegal, and the current Secretary of State, a Republican, halted the process the day after it started. But Republicans in Nevada say they won't be deterred. And Cisco says this difference in motivation between Republican and Democratic voters is a big reason for concern.
36% of Nevadans believe what my opponent is selling. But the problem is 100% of those 36% are going to get on a vote. They're motivated. They have some reason or some role or responsibility or obligation they know to vote.
If we get all of our secretaries of state elected around the country like this, we take our country back. If you show up on November 8 en masse with such a turnout, it doesn't matter what they do, we overwhelm the system.
I won't allow our election infrastructure to be used as part of a political theater to spread the big lie, because the big lie is dangerous. It's been the basis of voter suppression. It's what's incentivizing these attacks on our election infrastructure, the threats to election workers.
Far-right election deniers, extremists are threatening Republican and Democratic election officials to try to intimidate us or to get folks to step down.
Secretary Griswold, as well as other secretaries of state, have personally experienced these threats stoked by Trump's lies. But they've only made her work harder. Protecting election workers, voters, and the vote itself will be a primary concern for all states in the coming years. Nevada, for example, is a critical battleground state. It helped decide the 2020 election for Joe Biden and has some of the closest races in this midterm election.
Nevadans are going to determine who the next president of the United States is. And if we have a Secretary of State who's doing things that aren't exactly the way they should be done, they could influence the outcome of that election, impact Nevada, but also impact the rest of the country. And that's scary to me.
And while secretaries of state are partisan offices, the work they do shouldn't be.
What my work is to protect the right to vote of every eligible Republican, Democrat, and unaffiliated voter, so they can make their voice heard in free and fair elections, free from intimidation.
The Secretary of State is a neutral arbitrator of our elections. You're there to just protect the basic premise of democracy.
Citizens of the United States are granted a right to vote. Within that right is a world of possibilities that doesn't end on Election Day. It's about believing you're an active participant in the way your country governs.
The ability to make sure that our policy pushes this country forward, it is inherent inherently tied up with the vote. To be able to have those champions to make great change, we have to get them elected. And that means that everyday people have to have their voices heard in free and fair elections.